Should Christians be sick? Now, probably for most of you watching this video, especially if you're from outside of the church, the answer is quite obvious. Well, yeah, why should Christians be any different from anyone else? But what if I were to tell you that there's a small yet vocal minority who genuinely believe that Christians shouldn't be sick? But before going any further, let me quickly point out that in this video, I'm not at all saying that God can't heal. Rather, what I'm trying to refute in this video is what's commonly referred to as the health and wealth gospel, largely promoted by your so-called faith healers on TV. That somehow perfect health is a divine, God-given right for the Christian. That a Christian can be healed from anything from the common cold to even cancer. Guaranteed, just as long as he or she believes and does not doubt. So what does the Bible really have to say about sickness and the Christian? Well, you may be surprised to know that there were various New Testament figures who suffered from serious illnesses. And in this video, we're briefly going to look at 4 of them, saving the best to last. So please make sure you watch this video all the way to the end. Now, it was probably during the Apostle Paul's first Roman imprisonment, which you can read about in Acts chapter 28, when the Philippian church sent a man by the name of EPAPHRODITUS to take care of Paul. Unfortunately, during his stay in Rome, poor EPAPHRODITUS came down with a serious illness which almost proved to be fatal. In fact, that's one reason why Paul wrote his letter to the Philippians, was to simply let them know that EPAPHRODITUS had recovered. Yet, what's interesting about that entire episode is that clearly Paul didn't look down upon EPAPHRODITUS as though somehow he had failed in his mission. Rather, quite the opposite. When you read what Paul has to say about him in Philippians, it's very clear that Paul saw him as a man possessing great faith, not as a man somehow lacking in faith. In Paul's second letter to Timothy, he informs Timothy that he unfortunately had to leave behind a colleague of theirs, a man by the name of TROPHIMUS, who had become seriously ill in the city of Miletus. Now, just as with EPAPHRODITUS, Paul clearly didn't look down upon TROPHIMUS. He didn't complain to Timothy that he had prayed many times for Trophimus, but well, you know, Trophimus just didn't have enough faith to be healed. For both Paul and Timothy, they knew that sickness was a fact of life, that Christians got sick just like everyone else. And speaking of Timothy, in Paul's previous letter to him, he speaks of Timothy's frequent illnesses. That's right, folks. Paul's right-hand man, the man who took over the ministry after Paul's execution, suffered from chronic illnesses. Yet nowhere does Paul chastise Timothy for his so-called lack of faith. Timothy may have been a spiritual giant, but he certainly wasn't immune to sickness. He was no superhuman. And after all, how could Paul, of all people, condemn any of these men, considering that he himself had previously suffered from a serious illness? In his letter to the Galatians, he reminds them that the reason why he even preached the gospel to them in the first place was because he had become very sick, possibly from malaria. Whatever the illness, it detained him in the area, and being the evangelist he was, he planted churches. So okay, what does all of this mean for you and I today? Well, full disclosure here, when I was younger, I was a firm believer in this health and wealth gospel. And yet for me, it's simply an embarrassing part of my past, which I'd rather forget. But for others, it's far more serious. There are many believers who go to their graves because of a terminal illness, sincerely believing that they had failed God. What's more is they leave behind grieving loved ones that are full of regret and condemnation, thinking that, well, maybe if they had believed more, maybe if they had had more faith, their loved one would still be alive today. And yet what I hope to have shown in this video is that clearly the Bible doesn't teach perfect divine health. I don't know about you, but the 4 men that I just mentioned were far more spiritual than I can ever hope to be, and yet they were sick. Why does God heal some and not others? Well, that's the age-old question, isn't it? And yet I think that healing depends more upon God's sovereignty than it does upon our mortal faith.